Greetings, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. I'm Cipher, and this is the Devil's Advocate Debate Club. Welcome back. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about the modern environmentalism movement and how I think it's actually hurting both the environment and environmentalism in general. Now, I'll start with a couple of literal examples and move backward into the more complex ones. To start, in my recent video about Greta Thunberg, the misguided and inarguably mentally ill, autistic child from Sweden who has been recently in the news. She has clearly been led mainly by statements by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and then repeated by others to believe that the environment is going to collapse in about a decade's time. Anyway, the example with Greta is her yacht trip, which, as I mentioned in my previous video, was bad for the environment for three separate reasons. The yacht itself took a huge amount of emissions to produce. The air trip wasn't saved since she had a crew fly over to sail the yacht back, so no trips were saved anyway, and flying isn't really that bad for the environment, but that's a whole nother thing. Then there was, oddly enough, the same weekend that a conservative group, this made me laugh when I saw the headline side by side, the same weekend that a conservative group cleaned up something like 50,000 tons of trash, an amazing amount of garbage, and I believe it was LA. A environmentalist protest in DC littered in amazing amount, mostly in like glitter and confetti, and set a dumpster on fire, doing, small but miserable harm to the environment. So environmentalists, a lot of them, are just people looking for an excuse to go out and protest, and this is the one that's popular. The people who really care about the environment tend to be doing something about it, not out there screaming in everyone else's faces about it. See, even in her UN speech, Greta mentions that, her generation will have to pump carbon out of the air with technologies that barely exist. Okay, they barely exist, but we also have a decade before the collapse she's talking about, and that is, as any actual environmentalist or environmental scientist will tell you, the beginning of a long cycle of potential planetary destruction, which they say would be outside of human control. But what what is outside of human control is a pool that shrinks every day as we develop more and more technologically. And so, as Greta says, these technologies barely exist, but we won't even really start needing them for another decade. Time to refine them along the way, and even after that, that's when the cycle, which will take hundreds of years to actually have an impact on, us in our environment, would go through. So we've got plenty of time. It's not that this isn't a problem, but there are solutions. And environmentalism, as it stands today, isn't really working towards any of them, and is in many ways working away from them. For instance, environmentalism today has a huge focus on Western society. They like to blame as much of it as possible on America as, the biggest net contributor in the Western world, and people like, Greta come to America or to other Western countries in order to do their big protests and big speeches, despite the fact that China and India are inarguably, by the numbers, the problem here. I mean, America could lower its carbon emissions and be good if we did, but we are not the issue, and zeroing our carbon emissions won't matter. So, America is like a gray sheep that the boy who cries wolf keeps telling you is the wolf. There's a wolf out there, but it's not us. And distracting from the real problems facing the environment, those problems notably being India and China, by putting as much focus as possible on America and the rest of Western society, is, well, turning a blind eye to the real problems. And since people love to hate America, I mean, there's plenty of reasons behind it, it also just gives them an easy out, an easy target to feel like they're fighting for something when they're letting the real problems sit by the wayside. So this takes us around to the claims that there's going to be some type of collapse in 10 years. This is based off of a UN study, which has been at least partially discredited. There's some back and forth on it, which suggests that there will be changes which are outside of human control, and we will set off a chain reaction in 10 years' time if things don't change. However, people starting with and expanding from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez will tell you that we're facing something like a global extinction event. Now, she has toned down her tune just a little bit on this after a huge amount that she was called out, because in one of her speeches she said that we face extinction in 10 years, basically. I forget the exact wording of it. Now, she has since then said, looks like my shadow's escaping us. She has since then said that anyone who believed that this was a literal statement to be interpreted, literally, has the social graces of a sea sponge, I think was the quote. But this is kind of a ridiculous thing to say as someone who's probably going to be running for office as a Democrat again, since 67% of the Democratic Party, when polled, not just thought she was serious, but believed her that we were going to be facing a global extinction event in 10 years if we didn't zero carbon emissions or reduce them by 50% in that time. Now, this is damaging for a number of reasons. For one, it creates the kind of extremism and fear that we've seen in the poor autistic girl I mentioned earlier in my video. But it also leads to a generation who grow up fearing for the environment, and potentially rightfully so, as there's lots of problems that we do face, who, once they see the predictions of their youth fail to come to pass, take a much more cynical view on environmental change from that point forward. It's where you get the climate change deniers of the millennial generation from. These are people who grew up and, were told by people who'd grown up in the 70s, were told in the 70s and 80s that, in 10, 15 years, the ice caps would be melting and we'd have irreparable damage, which turned out not to be true. It turns out that the reality behind climate change is a lot more complex than that. And it's going to take a lot more time and be a cycle of heating and cooling. It turns out that we had some of the facts wrong back then. And now that we're figuring them out, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have decided to be as hyperbolic as possible about them. So, from the failed predictions of the 70s, when they were talking about global cooling and all kinds of things, we have a generation of people who are, let's not call them climate deniers, but I would say climate skeptics. They've seen the science and believe that there's probably something to it, but none of them believe that it's as serious as climate scientists say it is getting to be, because, well, they've seen those predictions fail in the past. So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez can say that she was kidding, but we have, and I mean this, millions of people who believed her, millions of people who took her seriously and continue to take that statement seriously, who did not see or did not believe her correction. These people, in 10 years' time, when the environment doesn't collapse, are going to become the next generation of climate skeptics. They're going to be the people that in 20 years' time we're arguing with about how serious things are getting, because they've seen the big prediction of their generation fail. As we all know it will, it was a stupid thing to say. The next thing that the modern environmentalist movement has done, and the last I'll cover here, is I'm running out of time. Give me about 2 minutes. I'll be right there. Sorry, I'm holding up my ride. Anyway, so the final one I'll get to here is the Green New Deal and its focus on frontline communities and, well, reparations, something which have recently been shoehorned into the climate change movement. Reparations and just socialism, basically. And by tying these different political factions together, you tie their opponents together as well. So all of a sudden, people like Tim Pool, who support climate action, are completely against modern environmentalism because, well, it's basically just socialism wrapped up in the latest, prettiest political bundle. And by racializing environmentalism, it's the same thing I talked about when they tried to racialize common courtesy. There's a number of reasons why this is a bad idea that I don't think I even have to explain to you. But trying to tie environmentalism to another hot-button issue might gain you a little bit of support, but it's gonna gain you a lot more detractors. And, well, just look at the media surrounding the Green New Deal if you don't believe me. But hey, that's just my opinion. I've got to go. Thanks always for watching. I'm your host, Louis Cipher. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the Devil's Advocate Debate Club.